It begins in the hour when coffee tastes like coins and computers dream in green. Deep inside a mountain of Colorado granite, the night shift is steady and small. A few dozen people listening to the sky through machines, blinking at numbers that promise to tell the truth quickly and sometimes don't. Down the corridor, fluorescent tubes hum like distant insects. Console fans make a dry, constant wind. Somewhere behind the wall, a printer waits with its mouth open for whatever story the system decides to tell next. On paper, this is routine. On paper, the North American warning system is a ladder of checks. Space-based eyes that watch for heat, ground-based radars that catch hard things at the horizon, phones that carry news upward in sentences with code words in them. You are not supposed to climb the next rung unless the last one holds. You are not supposed to run. You are supposed to know the difference between hurry and panic. NTHE Night Crew knows the drill. They can recite it in their sleep, and many of them have. The console surfaces are clean of fingerprints. Grease pencils lie in a neat line like soldiers at ease. The monitors glow a familiar shade of not quite green, not quite blue, the color of decisions waiting to happen. There is also a tape, not a cassette that belongs in a glove box. A training tape, a program feed, a carefully prepared ghost of war built to test the room without touching the real world. Its purpose is simple. Wake the system with make-believe and see if the people inside the system can separate pretend from possible. The tape lives in a cabinet. It is labeled in a tidy hand. It is supposed to be harmless. Close the cabinet. Imagine the quiet belief behind that label, harmless. And outside the mountain, the world is a tangle of wires and winter light. Washington sleeps with one eye open. Bombers sit under floodlights that turn night into theater. Submarines count distances in heartbeats and propeller turns. A president sleeps a few miles from a phone that can soil mouths with code words before the sun knows what happened. The year is 1979, and the world has learned to keep living alongside countdown clocks. And back in the mountain, a routine artifact drifts into a place it doesn't belong. Sources differ on who touched what and when. Some say a technician loaded a tape into a system that should not have been connected to live circuits. Some say the lines between training and reality were too close for comfort and closer than anyone had admitted on paper. In a room down the hall, someone might have said, "Let's run the drill," the way you might say, "Let's test the fire alarm while everyone's at lunch." The words are harmless. The connections are not NA-like changes. Not dramatically. A status flips from calm to question. Consoles that usually whisper become specific. One monitor draws a ribbon of data that looks like intent. Another offers a count that means something or nothing, depending on which device you love more. The fast one that sees heat in space, or the slower one that will not guess until physics allows it. NAN operator leans in, pupils bright in screen glow. He has done this hundreds of times. He knows how to let a heartbeat be a metronome, not a drum line. He reads a line of type that was supposed to be a drill and discovers that drills don't announce themselves. They arrive as if they own the place. NHE calls it out, level and clear. The name of the system, the state, the count. The watch officer steps closer and begins to do what the book says a watch officer does. Confirm, cross-check, call. Phones begin to ring like rain that doesn't decide to become a storm yet. In other rooms, some above ground, some under, asleep men wake and sit up too fast. The sentence travels. Possible missile launch indications. The words are specific and cautious. They are also a match looking for dry tinder. NTHE tape is very good at its job. It was designed to be persuasive. It knows how to dress zeros and ones in a story the human eye recognizes too quickly. It paints a picture of launches, the kind you cannot ignore if you care about groups of cities. It does not say where the story came from. It does not advertise that it is fiction. It acts like truth because that is what it was made to do, under supervision and with warning labels. Tonight, the supervision is slightly left of where it should be. The warning label is in the wrong room. NTHE watch officer feels the floor tilt in a way the mountain's architects did not intend. He knows the ladder. He knows the window between space seeing and ground hearing. He knows the ritual to protect the world from a single system's bad night. He also knows the weight of the phones on the table, one for routine, one for history, one for the calls that do not fit either and never will. NHE orders the first calls. Not upward, not yet. Sideways. Cross-check. The early warning radars have their own tempo, their own rules. They are honest about the limitations of curvature and time. If there were launches, the horizon would feel them in minutes. But not this minute. The radars say, not yet. The computers say, now. NTHE Mountain dislikes disagreement. It was built to absorb shock, to endure, to contain. It was not built to host an argument between two parts of its own brain. But here is the argument. Alive on screens, spoken by trained voices, riding the edges of calm. Outside the mountain, pilots grab flight bags. In some stories, engines spool. In others, crews sit on the edge of chairs and wait for a word they hope not to hear. Either way, vectors come out of envelopes and become practice routes with their names erased. In an office with a carpet that kills footsteps, a duty officer dials a number with a cadence he keeps for only 2 or 3 nights of his life. NTHE watch officer orders satellites requeried. He wants different eyes. He wants another angle. Space has a voice in this building. It speaks in data rates and jitter and confidence percentages. Tonight, the voice is too confident. It is telling a story that resembles the one humans fear most. It is telling it with perfect posture. In Washington, somebody hears the first whisper and sits straighter. Lines open between buildings, each with its own portraiture on the walls and its own idea of what happens next. A national security advisor is told, in one version, that the sky might be cruel. He asks the only non-foolish questions. How many? How sure? Who else sees it? The answers are numbers that do too much work for their size. Enphones knit a net under the continent. Some threads are so old they still smell like Bakelite. Some are brand new and taste like metal when you put them against your lip. They carry sentences that are bloodless because bloodless words are easier to swallow fast. One sentence says, "We need confirmation." Another says, "We are attempting to confirm." A third, in a voice that hasn't decided if it will shake, says, "Stand by." NTHE training tape, still pretending to be the world, keeps doing its job. It produces more ghosts for more screens. It provides updates no one asked it to provide. It escalates because drills are written by people who are brave in conference rooms. What if the count increases? What if trajectories multiply? What if the pattern we fear most appears in miniature, serious enough to be a threat, strange enough to be a riddle? Deep in the mountain, the watch officer chooses vocabulary like a surgeon chooses blades. He refuses adjectives. He likes verbs that can be audited, assess, compare, verify, hold. He says hold more than once. The room obeys. That doesn't mean it relaxes. It means the tension becomes a rope they all grab with both hands. Someone asks the question out loud that everyone else was holding back. Could this be a simulation? The room does not like the taste of the word. Simulations are for daytime, for classrooms, for the safe cruelty of training, where you make good people fail in controlled ways so they will not fail when the world is watching. Simulations do not come at night without knocking. The watch officer doesn't answer right away. He knows that if he guesses wrong, the mountain will learn a new sound that no one here wants to teach it. He orders physical checks, not just data checks. Hands on drawers, eyes on cabinets, labels read out loud by people who have held those labels 100 times and never meant them more. A technician runs calmly the way you run in a library during a fire, down a corridor that knows his footfalls by heart. He opens a door and reads the words on a piece of hardware that doesn't look like much. He reads the words twice. He reads them into a phone that carries them back like a bird carries a seed. The words do not shout. They do not accuse. They do not weep. They say what they are. The room breathes, but not yet like relief, more like confirmation that the dragon they are fighting has a name. And back at the consoles, the numbers keep behaving as if reality were a courtesy. The watch officer refuses to let a tape, however persuasive, outrank geometry. He asks for the horizon again. He asks for the other sights again. He asks in a voice that makes the word again feel like a liturgy. The answers are still no plots, no skin paint, no hard returns. The sky cannot hide from radar forever. If something were coming, it would have had to show its face by now, at least to the people whose job is to notice faces against the curve of the Earth. NTHE room's oxygen changes by a degree you feel in your shoulders. Fingers unclench a little from the edges of clipboards. A clock that has been too loud becomes a clock again. The mountain learns it will not have to demonstrate the final purpose its builders carved out of granite for it to serve. NTHE watch officer turns the volume down on a speaker that was designed not to take no for an answer. He keeps the channel open. He keeps the ladder intact. He keeps the human inside the loop, where the human belongs. He begins to compose, in his head first, and then on paper, the sentence he will write in ink, suspected false training input. Actions taken. Withhold escalation. Cross-check. Verify with independent sensors. Notify. Investigate. And in offices far away from rock and humming air, people who matter listen as the mountain says, with the quiet of someone who knows he could have been wrong and wasn't, that the sky is clear. There is a pause. Then plans are unmade. Orders that were halfway to the end of their sentences turn around and go home. The night keeps its usual shape. Later, many years later, people will argue about which false alarm belonged to which headline. They will confuse dates by a day. They will put two different stories into the same paragraph, because the shape of fear is the same, even when the faces are different. But inside the timeline that belongs to this night, the training tape did what it was created to do, and exactly what it wasn't supposed to do. It taught everyone how thin the boundary is between practice and the kind of rehearsal that deserves quotation marks. NTHE next hours are made of paperwork that is really architecture. Engineers gather in stern rooms and ask impolite questions of systems that answer with logs and timestamps, and, when cornered, silence. Auditors follow wires with their fingers. Officers write paragraphs whose verbs are all spine and no spine tingle. Isolate, segment, segregate, interlock, gate. Policy writers sharpen pencils. The mountain itself, in a way that mountains rarely are, becomes self-conscious. It rearranges a few of its nerves. NBUT, we are getting ahead of the story. We are still in the minutes when a training tape wore a wolf's fur and padded, uninvited, onto a floor where people were taught not to flinch. We are still with the operator whose voice did not crack, whose hands did not flap. We are still with the watch officer who chose not to let speed colonize judgment. We are still in a room that learned, with an intimacy it did not want, exactly how vulnerable good intentions are when they meet a cable with the wrong label on it. What did it feel like? It felt like being on a narrow bridge you have walked across 1,000 times and suddenly thinking, unhelpfully, about the river below. It felt like a ritual interrupted and then performed perfectly anyway. It felt like the steady miracle of humans who have rehearsed courage until it becomes boredom, and then, called upon without warning, perform boredom so sincerely that it turns out to be courage after all. And phone calls end with phrases like copy and Roger and understood. They hang up gently, as if afraid to wake something that needs sleep. The night shift, a little older now than it was an hour ago, continues to do exactly what it was doing before the tape tried to make itself king. Screens glow. Fans hum. A pencil rolls an inch and is stopped by a finger that knows its path by heart. By morning, other mountains will know of this. New lines will be added to training manuals. A section marked Segregation of Simulation Inputs will sprout new branches. Someone will wrap a strip of red tape around a plug that was previously trustworthy. Someone will move a cabinet one room over. Someone will sign a memo whose purpose is to keep make-believe from reaching microphones again. NBUT before morning. There is one more thing. The feeling that follows fear when fear loses. It is not triumph. It is not even relief exactly. It is a quiet tiredness that tastes like copper, an old coffee, and the inside of a glove. The watch officer writes a final time on the log. He dots an I without pressing too hard. He straightens the stack of paper strips he has collected into a ribbon the way a person might straighten a tie before taking it off and putting it on a chair. NHE thinks of the word almost. It is a small word. It can hold a civilization. NHE leaves it on the page for the next shift to read. And that is where we pause, with the world intact and the lesson newly inked, before we open the file and follow the wires back to the bench that taught an entire system how easily make-believe can jump a fence. Now the room had to measure the gap, mark it in chalk, and build the kind of gate that doesn't forget to lock itself. NTHE, first hours after the scare belonged to the quiet professionals who live between. They didn't arrive with speeches. They arrived with notebooks, pencils already dull from other nights, and the kind of patience that has a toolbox. They started with the simplest question that always hides the most work. How did the pretend become the present? A technician guided them to a rack you wouldn't notice unless you'd loved it for years. A box with ports labeled in a code that looks like telephone numbers for machines. He tapped a panel with 2 thumbs, the way a person pats a dog to show it is good and also to tell it not to bite. This, he said without drama, is where training enters. This, a meter to the left, is where the real world does. They were close enough to touch elbows. Close enough that a cable moved by an inch on a busy day could turn a rehearsal into a rumor of war. They traced the harness with their fingers. They found a connector that had done nothing wrong yesterday and too much tonight. It had lived too long in the gray zone between permanently installed and so temporary we'll move it back in a minute. Gray zones are where stories like this learn to breathe. NTHE logbook, its cover scarred by 1,000 thumbings, offered times and initials. The initials belonged to people whose hands were steady when it mattered. Those people took turns standing in doorways, answering questions with verbs instead of excuses. No one in the room needed a villain. They needed a path. They were building one with the oldest tools in engineering. Admission, sequence, correction. Mon-news flowed up and out in chlorinated sentences. In one telling, a president's national security advisor's phone had already been lifted from its rest, his first words to the operator forming in his mouth. In other tellings, it hadn't rung yet, only thought about it. Memory would loop those seconds forever. What the room knew, and the later reports agreed on, was simpler. Confirmation from independent sensors had not matched the fear, and the fear had been told to sit down. NTHE Mountain's own post-mortem began with chalk on a whiteboard so old it had a memory of ghosts. A rectangle labeled SIM sat beside one labeled LIVE. An arrow was drawn, then erased, then drawn again with an extra box between them labeled GATE. A second hand added a word to the gate, HUMAN. The board looked like a child had tried to invent a castle. In truth, it was more boring and more beautiful. Plumbing. The future would run through it without leaking, and policy people arrived with the language that makes new rules hold in bad weather. Segregate simulation inputs from operational data paths. Require hard interlocks. Physical switches with keys before any training feed can reach any circuit that touches the alert ladder. Color code the cords, not just on paper but on their skins. Treat pretend as if it were radioactive. Only handled by people in gloves. Only moved in daylight. Only connected when 3 sets of eyes read the label and say the label out loud. More quietly, a softer doctrine received a tattoo. Phones climb ladders only after the second rung holds. Space may speak first. Ground must answer second. People must translate. It was not a new idea. Tonight, it received new ink. In nearby rooms, a different kind of investigation began. The friendly, dangerous kind that asks humans what they felt. The watch officer wrote a statement with sentences that sat square on the line. The operator who first read the numbers into the air wrote one too. Their prose shared an unintentional rhythm. Saw, checked, asked, held, confirmed. Those 4 words could fit on a badge. NTHE technician who ran to the cabinet was asked how he knew where to go. He shrugged and said, quietly, "I've been living with these boxes for years." That sentence was underlined in a summary later. You can't train experience fast. You can only keep it alive near the switches that matter. NBY Dawn, the scare had a case number, and the case had a recipe for prevention. The mountain exhaled. Above ground, pilots who had sat on the edge of readiness set their bags down and went home to houses where kitchens smelled like toast. In a windowless office with a carpet that doesn't keep footprints, a colonel signed a memo whose first line read, "Corrective actions, immediate." The second line read, "Lessons learned, permanent, NE elsewhere. The world made coffee and didn't know it had been lucky. That is what you want the world to do. That is the job." NTHE, weeks that followed were full of unsentimental chores. A training cabinet was physically moved into a room whose door now required 3 hands to open. A red bridge cable was fabricated with connectors that matched nothing else. If it wasn't on that cable, it couldn't cross. A small brass plate was screwed onto a rack. Simulation interlock, 2-key operation. The keys were stored in separate safes. 2 people had to decide it was daytime before make-believe could crawl toward a port. And on the software side, flags were added that could be read from 100 consoles. SIM feed active, no operational forwarding. If anyone ever again forgot which world they were in, 10 screens would shame them into remembering. A new rule insisted that drills never be piped through the same backbone as the real world. It was inelegant. It was safe. NTHE incident met the committees whose job is to be insufferable on purpose. They asked if a single tape in a single cabinet could masquerade as a war across multiple systems. What else could do the same? They drew lines on charts that reached further than the mountain. Bomber command, submarine warning nets, diplomatic hotlines, automated message traffic. How does pretend die before it meets a wire that can wake the world? If the answer wasn't immediate, the diagram got another box. Phones carried the sanitized story to Allied desks. The version those desks received was stripped of names and furnished with verbs. We experienced a training injection that reached operational displays. Confirmation procedures worked. Interlocks have been added. Segregations enforced. The message was received with the familiar cocktail of sympathy and relief. Every country that lives inside machines recognizes the humbling refrain, "There, but for the grace of separation, go we." And inside the mountain, the night crew that had kept its balance returned to their posts. The watch officer brought donuts and refused to admit they were a reward. The operator cleaned a smudge off the poster that diagrammed the ladder. Space, ground, notify. Someone had cut a small square of red vinyl and stuck it where the invisible 4th box lived. Human gate. It looked almost like a joke. It wasn't. There were still debates in quiet offices about what had happened and what might have. In one version, bombers had already begun to move, taxiing into the choreography that brings metal near runway lights. In another, engines never knew a thing. In one telling, a phone on a nightstand had made a man's heart sprint. In another, it had not reached that room. Memory is not a courtroom. It is a city of small kitchens where stories are cooked with whatever ingredients the cook can afford. What remained constant across every version was the same miracle. The people in the first room chose to let time prove itself. They let the Earth's curve do its job. They chose again and again not to let speed be the only virtue. They allowed the possibility that the first voice was lying. They demanded a second witness. This was not cowardice. It was the faith of professionals in the boring physics that outlast panic. NTHE Training Office rewrote its own gospel. Tapes would now carry an unmistakable watermark in their very data, patterned bits that operational circuits would recognize and refuse to pass. A training scenario would no longer need a label on a drawer. The label would live inside the ones and zeros, bright as a beacon to any machine that tried to pretend it didn't see it. Sometime later, months, not years, a new crew ran a drill under the new rules. The red cable was fetched from a safe by 2 keys. The interlock hummed awake. A console bloom announced to 3 rooms and 2 corridors. Simulation engaged, isolated. The count rose in the pretend world. The phones did not ring outside it. People did their jobs, including the most important one, knowing which universe they were in. NTHE watch officer from the night of the scare became, against his will, a footnote in training guides. His name wasn't there, his verbs were. The phrase, "do not let an algorithm recruit you," made it into a slide deck with calmer language. A bullet point read, "Maintain ladder discipline under simulated pressure." Somewhere in the speaker notes, a trainer had typed a single sentence for himself. "Remember to say thank you to the people who made a boring ending." NIF, you walked outside the mountain on a day a year later, you would see nothing different. The snow would still crisp under boots. The parking lot would still smell like oil when the sun warmed it at noon. Birds would still decide the wire was theirs and argue about it. But below, the wires were different. The fences that make-believe had jumped once now wore new barbs. The gate had 2 locks. The keys had 2 pockets. NTHE stories stayed quiet, as such stories do. A few paragraphs escaped into newspapers and fine print histories. Dates blurred with cousins of the same near miss in other seasons. The important part, the part that keeps children asleep, was not the headline. It was the work that followed, the slow and decisive knitting of humility into systems that had been a little too proud of their efficiency. NWE liked to think of safety as a switch. It is more often a braid. Human habit wrapped around physics, wrapped around policy, tied off with the bow of grace. That night in 1979, all 3 did their part. The habit said wait, the physics said horizon, the policy said dual confirmation. Grace said nothing as usual and did its work anyway. In later years, when a different system in a different room made a different mistake, someone would pull an old folder and find the notes from the tape incident. They'd read about the red cable and the 2 keys. They'd read about the watermarked bits that pretended could never hide. They'd apply the same idea to a new machine. They'd do it with a pencil. The sound would be quiet. The result would be loud only in its absence. Nothing terrible would happen that day for the same unglamorous reason. Someone had built a gate and locked it. What did the people who were there remember? Some remembered a taste, the metallic edge of coffee drunk too fast. Some remembered a sound, the click of a relay that chose to be a clock and not a siren. Some remembered a sentence they wrote at 3:12 that no one would frame. Suspected training input. Withheld, escalate. Awaited, corroboration. Negative plots, resolved. The rest of us remember only that we woke up the next morning and went to work. The mountain endures. Machines age. Their hum lowers in pitch and then rises again when boards are replaced. New crews inherit chairs that know the shape of vigilance. On the wall, the ladder still glows. Space, ground, notify. In the margin, invisible unless you know where to look, there is a small box that everyone pretends not to point at too often. Human. NSO. If you want the full measurement of that night, do not count only the phones that almost rang and the planes that almost moved. Count also the pencils that wrote the procedures that kept them from doing it again. Count the hands that learned where to put the red cable back. Count the minutes that stayed boring because people insisted on treating boring like a craft. And it begins, in memory, in training rooms, in our telling, with coffee that tastes like coins and screens that glow like aquarium glass. It ends, as it should, with the same room, a little wiser, a little more wired against itself, ready to sit through another midnight with the confidence of a custodian. The story's hero is not the tape or the terror or even the clever rules that followed. The hero is the refusal to hurry where hurrying does harm. Make-believe can jump a fence. We learned that. So we built a taller one, painted it red, put 2 locks on the gate, and handed the keys to people who know how to say hold, in a voice the world obeys. NTHE Mountain sleeps now in the way good machines do. Eyes open, alarm quiet, heart steady. Somewhere above it, the sky is moonlit and ordinary, which is the most beautiful thing a sky can be. The consoles hum a low note that owns the room the way a refrigerator owns a kitchen. A watch officer dots an I without pressing hard because graphite lasts longer when you don't demand too much at once. An operator straightens a stack of paper strips and smiles at how light evidence feels. NTHE World keeps walking its orbit. The wire is still thin. The people beneath it still hold their balance with pencils. And if you ever doubt that this matters, remember the night when a tape in a cabinet thought it was the sky, and the sky politely declined to be replaced. NTHAT is where we end, with the lesson inked, the gate locked, the keys in careful pockets, and the understanding that the best victories are the ones that look from the outside like nothing happened at all.